So, as listeners to any of my podcasts know, I'm a huge Star Trek fan, and you have now introduced the temporal element. So, I'm going to expand on that to the temporal timeline. So, fabulous reference, Mike. Maybe your best ever with the temporal element. In this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report, I'm back with fan favorite Mike DeBernardis, partner at Hughes Hubbard. We take a look at some of the key events, cases, and indices from Q4 of 2021 around compliance. We take a deep dive into the Lisa Monaco speech. We take a look at the Biden administration's strategy on countering corruption, and we consider what both of these will mean for the compliance professional going into 2020 and beyond. I know you'll enjoy this episode. The FCPA Compliance Report is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Mike DeBernardis, partner at Hughes Hubbard, for our quarterly review of the past quarter. First of all, welcome back, Mike.
Thanks, Tom. Happy to be back. Always fun to come on and talk with you.
Mike, as we recorded Q3, Lisa Monaco had just given her statement at the ABA white collar defense, and we intentionally held off on talking about that, although we both wanted to for this podcast. And I can't really think of a more significant event in 2021 for FCPA and compliance than that speech. So maybe I could ask you, I know this is something you guys have had to talk about internally. It's in the annual report. You certainly had to counsel clients on it. So maybe if you could give some of your big picture views of it, and then we can drill down into what it might mean for the individual CCO or compliance practitioner.
Sure. Yeah, and I think, the speech was anticipated. We knew something like this was going to come, right? We're in the first year of a new administration. The new administration likes to put their own stamp on enforcement and change policies. So we knew something like this was going to come, and we're sort of waiting for it to happen. I agree with you. It's probably when we look back at 2021, particularly given sort of the soft, that's not the right term, the comparatively low level of FCPA enforcement. I think when we look back at 2021, this will be the piece that stands out the most. So, the 3 points in there, right, in the speech, the 3 policy changes, if you will, in order to obtain full cooperation credit, the department is reverting back to the old policy where companies have to provide all information regarding individuals and individuals within the corporation who may have been involved. So this had been the policy under the Yates memo. It had changed during the last administration to allow companies to obtain full credit only by providing information about the individuals who were maybe substantially involved in the misconduct. But now the policy is shifting back to require full disclosure about all individuals involved in the misconduct. The second piece is taking a broader view of past misconduct. So when the department is looking at appropriate penalties and resolutions, it, historically has looked at past misconduct in that same area. So if you've got an FCPA case, you would look at past FCPA cases for the company. And now they will be taking a broader view to look at all past misconduct. Then the third piece is the approach towards monitorships, which I think might have the most immediate impact, which is, there had been a very clear trend away from monitorships, only using them in exceptional circumstances. And the approach now appears to be back to the approach taken under the Obama administration, which was, it's case by case, but monitorships are not disfavored and they'll be used when appropriate.
So let's start with maybe the first part, which they're all intriguing, so I can't say one interests me more than the other, but the reversion to the Yates memo. And one of the things I've seen I started kind of playing in this space about '07, is both an ongoing dialogue between the Department of Justice, practitioners like yourself, commentariat like me, and companies, but it's not all a one-way street. So sometimes the DOJ might pull back, sometimes they might listen, sometimes they might listen to people like yourself who have private conversations. I know they kind of listen to what the commentariat, and so to see a change in a policy no longer really surprises me. But I guess on this one, it seemed the DOJ wanted to take a little bit more control about how much, or rather their decision on who to prosecute. And if that's correct, would you see this as perhaps leading to more individual prosecutions, or do you have a different view on that?
My view on the Yates memo back, this is a long time ago, but our view internally here at Hughes Hubbard had really been the Yates memo it didn't change a whole lot, right? It put in writing a lot of what was already done. I mean, the idea that the department was ignoring individual misconduct and only focused on corporate wrongdoing was more played up than it actually was. And I think the Yates memo, in part, was to counter that narrative, to say, no, we are going after individuals. The exception, I think, comes with this idea of requiring the companies to basically provide all information about anybody who could potentially be involved in the misconduct. Because that has a lot of implications. One, it really requires the internal investigation that the company is doing to potentially be even broader than it might otherwise be. So you can envision a scenario where, for all evidence you've seen so far, no one else is involved, but it's possible. And so now, do we need to dig, as a company, do we need to dig farther? Do we need to dig deeper? Do we need to expand the scope of our investigation just to confirm that these individuals were not involved in misconduct or had no prior knowledge, in order to make that representation to the department? And I think that's potentially a big change for some clients. There's some companies, some clients who are going to do that anyway, because they want to make sure that they fully understand anybody who was potentially involved or aware of the misconduct. And then, to your point, I think that the department had gotten concerned that companies were making a determination on their own as to what substantial involvement meant, who really was culpable enough to require prosecution, and wanted to put that in the hands of the prosecutors. And I get that. I think from the company's standpoint, from the industry standpoint, there will be some concern that this change could potentially lead to prosecution of individuals for maybe very minor involvement in misconduct, or kind of questionable involvement. Although everything the department has said since these policy announcements were made has been to assure the industry and the defense bar that it will still exercise its discretion and ensure that only cases are prosecuted where there's evidence of crime. So, but I think there certainly is something to the idea that companies should not be the gatekeeper in terms of deciding which individuals were culpable enough to be prosecuted individually. So
that brings me to point number 2, which is the department now wants to consider other, i.e. non-FCPA conduct that violations which may have occurred, or investigations in the context of FCPA. I saw this as actually a part of DAG Monaco's speech around culture. And what I thought she was trying to do was connect, if you've had other substantive legal violations, is it a cultural problem within your organization? And is that something we as regulators need to address? Perhaps I read more into that connection than was made. I know others saw some things a little bit differently. And of all the pushback I've read or heard about since her speech, this one has engendered the most pushback, particularly at the ACI National FCPA Conference in late November of 2021. But it does represent a sea change. And if, as I said, I've sat in the general counsel's chair, and sometimes I didn't know all of the investigations that were going on a worldwide basis at my organization because some were, handled locally for an international company. And so there's that issue. But do you, so maybe we could start with, what do you see about this broader view of conduct that's going to be reviewed? And does it tie in your mind to this cultural aspect, or do you see the DOJ wanting to evaluate other incidents, if any?
I'm largely aligned with you in terms of I think the intention is to look at the cultural aspect. Is there something about the company in its culture, whether that's, we don't take compliance with the law that seriously, or we are over aggressive in our business practices? Is there something about the culture of the company that is leading to continued issues with breaking regulations or laws? This will be really interesting to see how it plays out, because one, and you just alluded to it, for large organizations, for some incredibly large organizations with various subsidiaries in different industries. Are they at a disadvantage now? I mean, the expectation would be that a larger organization is more likely to have regulatory or criminal issues in various different areas, whether it's tax in one place, or you might have an environmental issue, which I think was specifically mentioned. And how will a large organization be viewed, as compared to a smaller organization? And then there's a temporal element to it as well. How are they going to judge misconduct? That was maybe 10 years ago or 5 years ago versus something that happened last year. And so there's a lot of, I think, various ways that this could go. In some of the other announcements and speeches from new administration officials kind of around the same time, there has been a suggestion that, look, when we're looking at cooperation credit, when we're looking at what the appropriate resolution is, we will consider all of these aspects. We're going to consider, how long ago did the misconduct happen? How egregious was it? Who was involved? Were people punished? All of those things are important. I'm hopeful that that's the approach that the Department of Justice is going to take. I think things could get very tricky if, a company is sort of considered a recidivist for conduct that happened in an entirely different area, maybe a different geography, different industry, in a different subject matter 10 years ago, as compared to something that might happen today. That seems to me to be genuinely unfair, unless, as you suggest, they can really make a concrete showing as to, both of these incidents are a result of a poor culture, or some flaw in the way the company is being run or its compliance program is being managed.
We're going to have a quick message from our sponsor, and then we'll be right back with more from the FCPA Compliance Report. So, as listeners to any of my podcasts know, I'm a huge Star Trek fan, and you have now introduced the temporal element. So I'm going to expand on that to the temporal timeline. So fabulous reference, Mike. Maybe your best ever with the temporal element. But I know, I think it's your wife who is an antitrust lawyer. And so many people have said, well, antitrust there's certainly egregious antitrust violations, but also shading some antitrust violations, and there are differences of interpretation. And you can have some small antitrust matters and some very large ones where there are actual disagreements. And so my concern is, if there is sort of a disagreement with the law, or you want to push forward a new interpretation of the law, perhaps companies might get caught on that as well. Do you envision maybe even antitrust being a part of this analysis?
I mean, it certainly could, right? There's no indication that it is excluded. And I think that's exactly your point is really a broader one, right? Because when we think about corporate misconduct, often, we in our minds envision this is just a clear cut, right? There's a violation of the law, the company was punished, and we move on. But oftentimes it is close. Maybe there is a different interpretation. And for companies who are often, operating in the interest of their shareholders, they may decide, let's resolve this. We'll admit to the conduct. We'll pay the fine. We'll do, we'll remediate, whatever it may be, because that's in the best interest of the company and the best interest of our shareholders to have this resolved. When there might be a genuine dispute about whether this was an actual violation of the law. And I'm hopeful. Maybe I'm an optimist. I'm hopeful that all of these elements that we're talking about, how egregious was the prior misconduct, regardless of the subject matter of it, I'm hopeful that all of these elements will be considered by the Justice Department as we move forward, and they're considering, considering the appropriate resolution currently.
And Mike, the third component of the Monaco speech, as you alluded to, was monitors and monitorships, and how this Department of Justice has effectively revoked the Benchkowski memo and has at least put monitorships back in their quiver to be considered as a tool they might use. But I'd like to maybe tie that to what I also heard a department concern about recidivism. And it's recidivism where there's another violation or FCPA violation, the traditional type of recidivism, but also companies who are not comporting or complying with the terms of their DPA or NPA. Erickson was called out publicly by the Department of Justice in October, and it seems to me this DOJ is concerned about really not simply recidivism, but also companies following the DPAs or other settlement agreements. And so I was wondering what your thoughts might be around monitorships and the recidivist aspect.
Yeah, it's an interesting point because the department hasn't. The department has spoken. DAG Monaco spoke about the monitorship, the changes in monitorships, and others have spoken about this focus that the department is going to have on ensuring that the obligations under DPAs or NPAs are met, and at least the stated position that they're going to be more aggressive in punishing companies who violate terms of DPAs or NPAs. But as far as I know, they haven't tied the two together. Now, obviously, there's a pretty obvious connection between the two, right? Part of the job of the monitor is to ensure that a company is meeting its obligations under a specific agreement, and really doing so in a very hands-on manner in most cases. So I certainly think the two can be related. For me, the monitorship piece of this, when I started doing this work, everybody was talking about this trend towards monitorships. This was in 2007 or 2008, and then for the rest of my career up until 2020, 2021, monitorships were just a part of FCPA resolutions. They were a part of large corporate resolutions. It was every year we would in our annual alert we would talk about there's been so many this many monitorships. This is an increasing trend. This is just here to stay. And then all of a sudden it was so stark. Zero monitorships in 2020. I think zero in 2021. At least in the FCPA context. And it was so stark, so surprising, also because some of the resolutions involved the type of sort of pervasive misconduct, widespread misconduct that had historically always led to a monitorship. This change was not surprising to me. I think it will, as I mentioned before, be one of the policy changes that we see the most immediate impact. Like I would be very surprised if we go through 2022 without any FCPA monitorships imposed in the resolutions. Recidivism or the sort of breaches of NPA and DPA point that you made it's not new, but it's not something that I had historically heard the department focus on as though it was a pervasive problem. We had, of course, had cases where you had DPAs extended or monitorships extended because obligations weren't met. But the way that the department has been talking about it now suggests that this is a major problem with companies violating the terms of their DPAs or MPAs, and the punishment is not just going to be an extension. The punishment could be, revoking the DPA or MPA, which is a really serious outcome, or additional obligations that aren't just simply, hey, we'll extend the same agreement for another year. So that's something I think really is important to watch. I will be very interested to see if they do get back into imposing monitorships and imposing monitors and having that back as a regular mechanism, particularly in FCPA cases. Does the concern around the companies meeting their obligations dissipate a bit, because there will be the understanding that there will be a more watchful eye on companies during the course of their DPA or MPA period?
Mike, over the years we've done this, I've done podcasts with you. We've had a couple of themes, and one of the themes is that perhaps the most difficult discussion you as outside counsel would have with a board or other senior management and decisions they have to make is the decision whether or not to self-disclose. So I wanted to maybe end this section of our review of the Monaco speech by asking you, has this made that discussion even more difficult, or are there more moving parts you have to consider, or self-disclosure, our regulatory system, at least in the FCPA world, is largely built on self-disclosure. Are we moving towards a system now where the balance may slide down to less self-disclosure because of some of these trends, or do you think things may just sort of sort themselves out as they have in the past?
I think in the short term, these policy changes make that discussion more complex. In the FCPA context, we have the corporate enforcement policy, and that's been in place for a number of years now. I think us as practitioners have gotten used to having the conversations and understanding the various inputs into the decision of the department on a declination or receiving full credit, 50% credit for potentially off the bottom of the U.S. sentencing guidelines range. But there are a couple of changes that could affect that analysis. The first, which we discussed, is in order to be eligible for the corporate enforcement policy, you have to fully cooperate. And that, in theory, that now means disclosing all information about all individuals involved. And that, when you're having a conversation with senior leadership or the board, that makes the conversation more difficult. And then the second is, and I haven't seen much clarity on this yet, in cases of criminal recidivism, you are, in theory, under the corporate enforcement policy, sort of excluded from consideration for a declination or even one of the higher end reductions. And has that term changed now, right? Does that now include past misconduct for tax violations or a case of, violating environmental laws 10 years ago? We just don't know for sure yet. And until there's clarity on that, I think it could potentially change that discussion. And anytime when you have those conversations, the client's always looking for clarity. They're always looking for certainty. We can never give it, but the closer you can get to offering some clarity or certainty about how these various elements are going to be evaluated, the easier the conversation is. And I think these changes, at least in the short term, are gonna make things a little less certain, a little less clear, and make those conversations a little more difficult.
Mike, I now like to move to the announcement by the Department of Justice, the Biden administration in early December on the Statement of Countering Corruption. I've reviewed that in several other forums or temporal events, if I could use that term. So I don't want to go into the details of it, but my overall view of this is that it's going to unleash forces that some we can see and some we can't see because of the resources that are going to be made available by the federal government, but also the federal government's commitment to fighting corruption and elevating that to a national security issue. So I was wondering if maybe we could start with how are you and your colleagues at Hughes Hubbard really how have you analyzed these concepts, and what are the types of conversations you're having with clients around this document?
Yeah, it's a great point. It's a great question. I mean, I think most clients came and said, what does this mean for us? it's a hard question to answer because it's really not clear what this means for any specific company, any specific industry, except that, as you mentioned, we expect increased enforcement from various angles, just with additional resources coming, not just in the traditional, the Department of Justice will have additional resources to fighting FCPA, which they will and has been announced, but increased resources around the world. That might mean, there's a reference to ensuring that civil society, that investigative journalists in some of these countries are protected and have the resources they need. And so I think aside from that broad statement, it's been very difficult to say exactly what this means and how this is going to play out. But the possibilities are endless, as they say. I mean, that we can see the way this could impact enforcement in any number of industries from any number of angles, 3 times over. So I'll just use as an example the defense industry, because there's mention about, they talk about defense and security in the strategy document, and you could see, I think one of the dirty little secrets, it's a pretty open dirty little secret, is that when it comes to security and in places like Afghanistan, when we first went to Afghanistan and those places, that the money flows freely from the U.S. government, and it's not always fully controlled exactly as to how it's spent when security is at stake. That comes sometimes at the expense of compliance or corruption. And maybe that's changing. Maybe there's going to be obligations on companies involved in the defense industry in terms of whether those are reporting obligations, whether they're compliance obligations, or whether it's just an additional level of scrutiny and investigation that happens with respect to those funds. I think that's one area where you could potentially see it, and really kind of all over the place. You could say the same for financial services firms. You could say the same for frankly for lawyers and accountants, because there's a part of this strategy document that talks about holding gatekeepers accountable. And so really the possibilities are endless. We are keeping a close eye just to see how things start to play out in terms of rulemaking and maybe new task forces and that type of thing, so we can get a better handle on and provide better guidance to our clients in various industries.
Let me change the focus a little bit again, Mike, by moving to Activision Blizzard. And as we're recording this, in breaking news, Microsoft has announced they're acquiring the entity. So perhaps we may have discussions about that down the road. But several things intrigued me about this case, but the one I wanted to focus on was the allegations were of sexual harassment at the company, and the SEC said it was going to investigate. Traditionally, sexual harassment has been seen as an EEOC issue since the EEOC was enacted into law. And this is really one of the first cases I can recall where the SEC got investigated. And there was a fair amount of commentary by SEC lawyers saying this is really outside the remit of the SEC. It's not financial statement fraud or accounting fraud or any of those other issues. The SEC's response was, well, if it impacts your financial statement and it's illegal or fraudulent conduct, we're going to look at it. If you take that view, that's pretty much everything. I was wondering how if any, you guys had thought about that case, and is that something that you're having conversations or counseling clients around as well?
This was inevitable. Now, I say that because it really is a sign of the times. I think in some ways this dovetails with the focus of the SEC on ESG issues. There are, I think it's a recognition, or maybe the SEC is using it as an excuse, but it seems to be a recognition by the SEC that different things matter for shareholders than they used to, right? And so whereas in the past, and this could, whether it was 10, 20 years ago, shareholders cared about, are our financials correct? What's our profit and loss statement say? What is you hiding any losses? All of that type of stuff. Shareholders now have broader expectations and the value of a firm is derived differently, so that things like pervasive sexual harassment, pervasive sexual misconduct matters to shareholders. And the fact that you would potentially not have disclosed everything about that case is you're withholding material information from shareholders and making potential misstatements in that regard. So in that sense, I do think, times have changed, and I think this is sort of a natural outcome from that. To your point, though, it really is. It puts companies in a tough spot because this is a very broad approach that the SEC is taking, and as you said, basically puts everything on the table for what the SEC can investigate and what they won't in terms of disclosure and what matters to shareholders.
Mike, I'd like to end with a few thoughts on the antitrust world. I know that's not your primary area of expertise, but I think that we have discussed the sea change the Biden administration brought in the FTC with new Chairman Khan and her views on a more robust enforcement and perhaps expansion of antitrust law. Is the advice you gave before on the basics of a antitrust compliance program, has that changed, or is something else going on?
It hasn't changed. I would say something similar to what I would say if the new Justice Department came in and said we are taking very broad interpretations of our powers, and we are going to focus extremely hard on FCPA enforcement. Now, I would say the same thing to clients about their FCPA compliance program, which is make sure it's in really good shape and make sure you are recalibrating your risks, because everything you do now has become more risky because the government is taking a stricter view of this. And I'd say the same for antitrust compliance. Really, it is. We know that the FTC is taking a very broad view of their powers and taking a really strict view of what is considered unfair competition. And so you really, as companies, need to recalibrate your risks in those areas, provide training, and just be hyper aware that everything is a target now for the FTC, at least in the short term, until they're sort of this interpretation is challenged or knocked down. Really, it's just a matter of this is the time to focus in on your antitrust compliance and provide the training and doing all those things that you should do anyway, but you really want to do, especially when enforcement is going to be tight and strict.
I really like your phrase of recalibration of risk, and I think that really encapsulates probably the theme of this podcast even more than my temporal timeline. Star Trek reference. So, Mike, thanks again. Always fun to catch up, and I look forward to seeing what Q1 2022 brings us.
Me too. Thanks a lot, Tom.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. I hope you will check out my 5-part podcast series on the trial of the century, the Enron trial, which recently premiered on the Compliance Podcast Network. In this podcast series, I visit with business journalist Lauren Steffi, who covered the trial for the Houston Chronicle as its business columnist. We take a look at what led to the trial, some of the key witnesses and moments from the trial, and what the trial inevitably meant going forward. It's a fascinating look at the Enron trial some 15 years after it occurred. I know you'll enjoy this special podcast series. The FCPA Compliance Report is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.